Sometimes the greatest change in a man's life begins with the stranger he almost turned away. The wind carried the dry scent of prairie grass across the Montana Valley as Jacob Carter guided the last of his cattle through the western gate just before sunset. Golden light stretched across nearly 200 acres of weathered pasture, turning every fence rail into a ribbon of amber while the distant mountains slowly disappeared beneath a veil of autumn haze. It was the same view Jacob had greeted almost every evening for the past 15 years, and yet it never seemed any less lonely. The ranch had belonged to his father before him, and to his grandfather before that, but time had quietly taken every familiar voice away until only the land remained. The old farmhouse stood proudly against the wind, its white paint faded by decades of harsh winters, its porch creaking with every changing season. The barn leaned slightly toward the north where countless storms had tested its strength, but it still sheltered faithful horses that knew Jacob's footsteps long before they heard his voice. Every sunrise demanded work. Every sunset rewarded endurance. That rhythm had become the only conversation he truly trusted. Jacob removed his worn leather gloves, hung them over the saddle horn, and gently patted his bay gelding before leading him toward the stable. Even the horse seemed to understand the quiet that followed each day's labor. No laughter drifted from the house. No warm light welcomed anyone home except the lantern Jacob lit himself every evening. He had long convinced himself that solitude was simply another responsibility carried by ranchers who chose land over crowded towns. As he finished closing the pasture gate, something unusual caught his attention. A figure stood motionless beside the entrance to the ranch, almost hidden by the lengthening shadows. She had not called out for help. She had not waved her hands or stepped onto his property without permission. She simply waited with remarkable patience, one hand resting lightly upon the reins of a tired chestnut horse. Jacob studied her from across the yard. She wore a simple earth-colored buckskin dress beneath a woven shawl, sturdy moccasins dusted by many miles of travel, and around her neck rested a weathered leather necklace darkened by years of careful use. Her long black hair was neatly braided, and her calm brown eyes watched the ranch with quiet respect instead of curiosity. She looked neither frightened nor uncertain. She looked like someone who had already decided where she belonged long before arriving. Jacob walked toward the gate, his boots crunching softly across dry gravel while a cool breeze stirred the cottonwood leaves overhead. When he finally stopped a few feet away, the woman offered a small, respectful nod. "Good evening," she said gently. Her voice carried the calm confidence of someone who measured words carefully before speaking them. Jacob returned the greeting with polite caution. Travelers occasionally stopped by asking for water or directions, but something about this visitor felt different. She was not searching for the nearest town. She was searching for this ranch. For several long moments, neither of them spoke. The only sounds came from distant cattle settling into the pasture and the steady whisper of wind moving through the valley. Finally, the woman lifted her eyes to meet his. "My name is Naya White River," she said. "May I work here until winter ends?" Jacob frowned slightly, surprised by the unexpected request. "Why this ranch?" he asked. Naya glanced slowly across the weathered barn, the open pasture, the farmhouse, and the fading sunlight stretching across the land before quietly answering. "Because I believe this place has been waiting for both of us, even if neither of us knew it yet." Jacob stood quietly for a long moment, studying the woman waiting patiently beyond the ranch gate while the last rays of sunlight settled across the valley. Travelers often carried urgency in their voices. Some asked for directions before they even introduced themselves. Others looked exhausted, frightened, or desperate after long days crossing the frontier. Naya White River carried none of those expressions. She stood with calm confidence, her hands resting lightly upon the worn leather reins of her horse, as though she had already accepted whatever answer he might give. Jacob finally pushed the gate open with a slow creak of weathered wood. "Winter is not a short season in Montana," he said. "Most people who ask for work leave after the first heavy snowfall." Naya smiled gently. "Then I will stay until the snow no longer asks me to." Her answer caught him off guard. It was simple, thoughtful, and carried no trace of arrogance. Jacob stepped aside, inviting her onto the property with a small nod. "You can stable your horse in the east barn. There is fresh water behind the house." She thanked him quietly before leading the chestnut mare across the ranch yard. As they walked, Jacob noticed how naturally she moved through the property. She never hurried. She paused briefly to close the pasture gate after entering, adjusted a loose bucket that had been left near the well, and gently greeted the old sheepdog lying beside the porch. Even the aging dog, usually cautious around strangers, slowly wagged his tail before following her toward the barn. Jacob found that strangely surprising. After the horses had been brushed and fed, he showed her the small guest room at the back of the farmhouse. The room contained only a narrow wooden bed, a washstand, a simple rocking chair, and a window overlooking the western pasture where the evening sky still glowed with fading shades of orange and crimson. "It is not much," Jacob admitted. Naya looked around the quiet room before smiling warmly. "It is peaceful. Sometimes that is much more." As darkness settled across the ranch, Jacob prepared a modest supper of fresh bread, beans, roasted potatoes, and hot coffee. They sat across from one another at the old pine table where he had eaten alone for more years than he cared to count. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, only unfamiliar. Jacob realized he had grown so accustomed to speaking only to horses and cattle that sharing a meal with another person almost felt like learning an old habit all over again. Naya noticed a faded family photograph resting upon the shelf beside the fireplace. "Your parents?" she asked softly. Jacob nodded. "And my grandparents." His voice remained steady, though his eyes lingered. "On the worn picture a little longer than usual. This ranch has belonged to my family for nearly 70 years. Naya studied the photograph with quiet respect. "Then they must have loved this land very much." Jacob looked toward the windows where darkness had completely covered the valley outside. "They did." After a brief pause he added, "Sometimes I wonder if I have loved it so much that I forgot everything else." Naya lowered her coffee cup without answering immediately. The fire crackled softly inside the stone fireplace while the old clock on the mantel counted each passing second. Finally she spoke. "Land does not ask us to choose between work and happiness. Sometimes we simply forget there is room for both." Her words lingered in the warm room long after the conversation ended. Later that night, as Jacob extinguished the lantern before climbing the stairs, he glanced once more toward the kitchen. Naya had quietly washed every dish without being asked, neatly folded the drying towels, and placed fresh water beside the fireplace for morning coffee. They were small gestures, almost invisible, yet the old farmhouse somehow felt different already. For the first time in many years, the silence inside those weathered walls no longer felt empty. It simply felt as though it had been waiting for another heartbeat to join its own. The following morning arrived beneath a pale blue sky brushed with thin clouds drifting slowly above the Montana Valley. Frost clung to every fence rail, and the crisp air carried the clean scent of pine, fresh earth, and wood smoke rising from the farmhouse chimney. Jacob had already finished feeding the horses before sunrise, expecting another ordinary day filled with familiar routines that never seemed to change. Yet when he stepped into the barn carrying 2 buckets of grain, he paused in quiet surprise. Every stall had already been cleaned. Fresh straw lay neatly spread across the wooden floor. The water troughs had been scrubbed until they reflected the morning light, and every saddle hung carefully in its proper place instead of resting wherever exhaustion had left it the evening before. Jacob looked around the empty barn before, hearing soft footsteps outside. Naya was brushing her chestnut mare beneath the old cottonwood tree, moving with calm patience while the horse lowered its head as though completely at peace beside her. She looked up when she noticed him watching. "I hope you do not mind," she said gently. "The horses deserved a clean morning." Jacob slowly shook his head. "You have already done more work before breakfast than most ranch hands finish by noon." Naya smiled without pride. "Work becomes lighter when someone shares it." Those simple words remained with him long after they rode toward the northern pasture together to inspect damaged fencing left behind by the previous season's storms. The valley stretched endlessly before them, golden grass rolling across gentle hills, while distant snow rested quietly upon the mountain peaks. A cool breeze carried the songs of meadowlarks drifting through the open country, and for the first time in many years Jacob realized he was noticing sounds he had stopped hearing long ago. As they reached the old fence line, Naya dismounted and quietly examined the surrounding ground instead of immediately picking up the repair tools. She knelt beside a patch of wild sage, gently touching the soil before looking toward a narrow stream winding through the pasture. "This fence should move a few feet farther from the water," she said. Jacob looked puzzled. "It has stood here for nearly 30 years. Naya nodded. "The stream has changed its path little by little. The horses no longer have enough room to reach the clean grass growing beside the bank. They are wearing the same ground every day." Jacob studied the pasture more carefully. Until that moment, he had never noticed how bare the earth had become around the old fence. They spent the rest of the morning moving several fence posts and opening a wider section beside the stream. By afternoon, the horses wandered naturally toward fresh grass they had not reached in years. Even the oldest mare, usually slow and stubborn, crossed the new opening without hesitation. Jacob leaned against the repaired fence, watching the quiet scene unfold beneath the bright autumn sky. "How did you know?" he finally asked. Naya rested one hand upon the smooth wooden rail. "My grandfather always said the land speaks very softly. Most people believe it is silent because they never stop long enough to listen." On the ride home, another unexpected change greeted them. The old sheepdog that usually slept alone beneath the porch was happily following Naya through the yard with a wagging tail, while a pair of nervous barn cats that rarely allowed anyone near them calmly rested beside the kitchen steps. Jacob laughed quietly, surprised by the unusual sight. "I have lived with those cats for 6 years," he admitted. "They still do not trust me." Naya looked toward the animals before smiling warmly. "Trust grows the same way grass does, quietly, one day at a time." As evening settled over the ranch, Jacob stood on the porch watching lantern light glow softly through the farmhouse windows. The buildings had not changed. The land had not changed. Yet somewhere between sunrise and sunset, the ranch itself seemed warmer than it had felt in many years. And for the first time since inheriting every acre, Jacob found himself wondering whether a home could begin changing long before anyone realized that the people inside it already had. Nearly 2 weeks passed before the people in the nearest town began noticing that something had quietly changed at Jacob Carter's ranch. The transformation was not dramatic enough to make newspaper headlines or become the subject of excited conversation at the general store. It appeared instead through dozens of small details that only observant eyes could recognize. The old fences stood straighter than they had in years. Smoke rose from the farmhouse chimney every morning before sunrise, carrying the comforting scent of fresh bread instead of burned coffee. Wildflowers had begun blooming beside the front porch where only dry weeds had grown through the previous summer. Even the horses looked healthier as they wandered peacefully through greener pasture beside the stream. Jacob himself had not realized how much the ranch had changed until one Saturday afternoon when he rode into town for supplies. As he tied his bay gelding outside the feed store, old Samuel Brooks, who had known Jacob since childhood, smiled beneath his gray mustache. "Your place looks better every time I pass it," he remarked while loading grain sacks onto a wagon. "Looks like somebody finally convinced you that a ranch deserves more than endless repairs." Jacob gave a small, uncertain smile. "It has had some extra help lately." Samuel nodded thoughtfully before lowering his voice. "People have noticed." Jacob understood exactly what those words meant. Small frontier towns rarely kept secrets for long. By the time he finished purchasing flour, coffee, nails, and lamp oil, he had already noticed curious glances from several townspeople. No one spoke disrespectfully, yet quiet whispers followed him as naturally as the autumn wind. Most had already heard that an Apache woman was living at his ranch. Some viewed it with simple curiosity. Others clearly struggled to understand. Jacob chose not to answer questions that no one had gathered enough courage to ask directly. He returned home beneath a wide afternoon sky painted with drifting white clouds and the golden colors of early October. As he approached the ranch, he saw Naya kneeling beside the vegetable garden, carefully covering young plants with woven straw to protect them from the colder nights ahead. Nearby, the old sheepdog slept peacefully beneath the porch while the horses grazed beside the widened stream without crowding one another. Everything looked calm. Everything looked exactly as a home should. That evening, another visitor arrived unexpectedly. A polished carriage rolled slowly through the ranch gate, pulled by 2 well-groomed black horses whose harnesses gleamed beneath the fading sunlight. The gentleman who stepped down wore an expensive wool coat, polished boots, and a neatly pressed hat that had likely seen more town sidewalks than prairie dust. He introduced himself with confident courtesy. "Charles Whitford," he said, extending a gloved hand. "I have admired this valley for many years." Jacob welcomed him politely onto the porch while Naya quietly brought fresh coffee without interrupting the conversation. Charles accepted the cup with appreciation before turning his attention toward the surrounding land. His eyes carefully measured every pasture, every fence, and every hill stretching toward the distant mountains. "Mr. Carter," he began calmly, "I believe this ranch sits on some of the finest land in Montana. I recently purchased several neighboring properties, and yours would complete the entire valley." Jacob remained silent, sensing where the conversation was leading. Charles reached into a fine leather briefcase and carefully removed several folded documents. "I would like to make you an offer generous enough that you would never need to worry about another difficult winter." Before Jacob could answer, Charles glanced toward Naya, who stood quietly near the garden watching the evening light settle across the fields. "With such a future," he added politely, "both of you could begin a far easier life somewhere else." Jacob looked from the neatly written contract to the woman who had quietly brought warmth back into a house he had nearly forgotten could feel alive. For the first time in many years, the value of his ranch no longer seemed measured by acres or dollars. And as the cool evening breeze carried the scent of fresh earth across the valley, he realized the decision before him would test far more than his business judgment. Charles Whitford left the ranch just before nightfall, promising to return in 3 days for Jacob's answer. The polished carriage disappeared beyond the cottonwood trees, leaving only 2 narrow tracks pressed into the dusty road, while silence slowly reclaimed the valley. Jacob remained standing on the porch long after the sound of wagon wheels had faded. The leather folder containing the purchase offer rested upon the kitchen table behind him, untouched. It represented more money than he had ever imagined earning in a lifetime. With that payment, he could replace every worn saddle, every aging fence, every leaking roof, and still have enough to live comfortably without another difficult winter. Yet the thought brought him no peace. Before Naya arrived, he might have accepted without hesitation. The ranch had always been land to protect, buildings to repair, and cattle to feed. Now it had quietly become something more difficult to measure. The following morning the sky changed without warning. Heavy gray clouds gathered over the western mountains, swallowing the blue horizon beneath layers of dark autumn mist. A cold wind swept through the valley, bending tall prairie grass and sending dry leaves spinning across the yard. Jacob studied the sky while tightening the barn doors. "A hard storm is coming," he said quietly. Naya looked toward the distant peaks where the clouds had nearly disappeared into one dark wall. She nodded calmly. "We still have time if we begin now." Neither of them wasted another moment. They moved together through the ranch with quiet purpose. Jacob secured the stable roof, reinforced loose shutters, and carried extra feed into the barn, while Naya stacked fresh firewood beneath the porch, covered the vegetable beds with woven straw, and checked every water barrel before the temperature dropped. There was no panic, only steady work shared without unnecessary words. By late afternoon, the first cold rain arrived, drumming softly across the barn roof before changing into wet snow that drifted sideways beneath powerful gusts of wind. Inside the stable, the horses shifted uneasily until Naya walked slowly between the stalls, speaking to them in a gentle voice that Jacob could not fully understand. One by one, the restless animals settled. Even the oldest mare lowered her head peacefully while the young colts stopped pacing. Jacob watched from the doorway with quiet amazement. "They trust you," he said. Naya smiled faintly. "Animals do not listen to words first. They listen to calm." The storm continued through the evening, surrounding the farmhouse with the steady sounds of falling snow, crackling branches, and wind sweeping across the open pasture. After checking every building one final time, Jacob returned inside, carrying fresh logs for the fireplace. The warm glow filled the room while the scent of pine smoke blended with homemade stew simmering gently on the cast-iron stove. They shared supper beside the fire, listening to the storm beyond the thick wooden walls. After a long silence, Jacob looked toward the folded contract still resting on the kitchen table. "Charles believes this ranch is worth a fortune," he said quietly. Naya followed his gaze, but did not touch the papers. "What do you believe?" she asked. Jacob looked around the room. He noticed clean lantern glass reflecting the firelight, fresh herbs hanging neatly beside the window, carefully mended curtains, and the old sheepdog sleeping peacefully near the hearth. Every small change had appeared so naturally that he had almost forgotten the house once felt empty. He looked back at Naya. A few weeks ago, I would have answered with a number. He paused, listening to the storm outside while the fire crackled gently between them. Now I am beginning to think the most valuable things inside this ranch cannot be written into any contract. Naya lowered her eyes with a quiet smile, saying nothing more. Outside, the wind slowly lost its strength, and as the first peaceful silence returned after the storm, Jacob realized that facing difficult weather had become easier simply because he was no longer facing it alone. Morning sunlight returned to the valley as though the storm had never existed. Fresh snow rested lightly upon the distant mountain peaks, while the lower pastures glistened beneath countless drops of melting ice. The air smelled clean, carrying the rich scent of damp earth, pine, and fresh grass awakening beneath the first warmth of the day. Jacob stepped onto the porch with a steaming cup of coffee and looked across the ranch that had survived another difficult season. Every fence still stood. The barn roof had held against the wind. Smoke drifted peacefully from the chimney, and somewhere beyond the western pasture, horses grazed quietly beneath a sky so clear it seemed almost endless. He realized that surviving the storm had not felt like a struggle. It had felt like working beside someone who understood the land as deeply as he did, though in a completely different way. Naya was already walking toward the creek carrying a woven basket filled with small willow cuttings. Curious, Jacob followed her across the pasture where the widened stream flowed gently between smooth stones polished by generations of moving water. She knelt near the eroded bank and carefully pressed each young cutting into the moist soil. Jacob watched silently before asking, "What are you planting?" Naya brushed a little earth from her hands and smiled. "Roots that will protect the bank before next spring." He looked around the quiet creek. "Will a few small trees really make that much difference?" She nodded. "Not this year. Perhaps not even next year. But one day they will hold the soil together, shade the water, and keep the grass alive through dry summers." Jacob studied the tiny branches disappearing into the earth. They seemed almost too small to matter, yet somehow he believed every word she spoke. During the following weeks, he noticed more quiet changes spreading across the ranch. Birds returned to nest near the creek where they had rarely gathered before. The horses spent longer hours grazing calmly beside the healthier pasture. The vegetable garden produced stronger harvests than it had in many years. None of it felt miraculous. Every improvement came through patience, careful observation, and steady work shared between two people who respected both the land and each other. Word of those changes gradually reached the nearby town. Ranchers who had once wondered why Jacob had welcomed an Apache woman onto his property now found themselves stopping beside the front gate to ask practical questions instead of offering doubtful opinions. One neighbor wanted to know how the pasture remained greener after the storm. Another admired the healthier horses. An elderly widow quietly thanked Naya for showing her how to protect her small garden from early frost. Jacob noticed something remarkable. No one spoke about differences anymore. They spoke about ideas, harvests, weather, and hope. One crisp afternoon, while repairing a wagon wheel together beneath the shade of the cottonwood trees, Jacob looked toward Naya with thoughtful eyes. "You have changed more than this ranch," he said softly. She gently set down the wooden spoke she had been shaping. "People change themselves," she replied. "Sometimes they simply need a reason to begin." Before Jacob could answer, the distant sound of carriage wheels echoed once again. Along the county road, Charles Whitford's elegant carriage slowly appeared beyond the hill exactly as promised, its polished black horses moving steadily toward the ranch. The leather contract still waited inside the farmhouse where Jacob had left it untouched. This time, however, everything around him felt different. The old porch carried flower boxes filled with late autumn blossoms. The barn stood stronger after repairs they had completed together. The sheepdog slept peacefully beneath the front steps, while meadowlarks gathered near the creek lined with young willow trees that would one day become a forest. Jacob quietly realized that Charles had not returned to determine the future of the ranch. He had returned to hear the answer that Jacob's heart had already given long before his words would. Charles Whitford stepped down from his carriage with the same quiet confidence he had shown 3 days earlier, but this time he paused before speaking, taking a longer look across the ranch than he had before. The morning sun rested gently over the valley, illuminating fields that seemed more alive than when he had last visited. Horses grazed peacefully beside the widened creek, smoke drifted lazily from the stone chimney, and rows of vegetables stretched behind the farmhouse beneath neat woven coverings prepared for the coming frost. Charles adjusted his gloves and smiled politely. "I must admit," he said, "your ranch looks even finer today." Jacob welcomed him onto the porch, where 2 cups of fresh coffee already waited beside the weathered wooden table. Naya greeted the visitor with the same calm respect she offered everyone, then quietly returned to hanging freshly washed blankets where the autumn breeze carried the scent of clean cotton across the yard. Charles noticed her only briefly before opening the familiar leather case and placing the unsigned contract upon the table once again. "I trust you have reached your decision," he said. Jacob rested one hand upon the papers without opening them. For a long moment, he looked beyond the porch toward the valley his family had worked for generations. He remembered long winters spent repairing broken fences alone, silent evenings inside an empty farmhouse, and countless mornings when work had filled every hour while joy quietly disappeared between them. Then he looked toward Naya, who was smiling gently as the old sheepdog followed her across the yard with slow, faithful steps. Nothing about the ranch had become easier since she arrived. There was still wood to split, cattle to feed, roofs to maintain, and seasons to survive. Yet every burden somehow felt lighter because it was no longer carried by one pair of hands. Jacob slowly folded the contract and returned it unopened to Charles. "I cannot sell," he said quietly. Charles remained silent, waiting for an explanation rather than arguing. Jacob looked around the porch one final time before speaking again. "For years I believed I owned this ranch because my name appeared on the deed. I understand now that ownership is not the same as belonging." Charles studied him thoughtfully. "You are refusing a remarkable offer." Jacob nodded. "I know." He glanced toward Naya once more. "But the greatest investment anyone ever made here was never written on paper." Charles followed his gaze and finally smiled with genuine understanding. "Sometimes the finest business decision is not a business decision at all," he admitted while carefully placing the contract back into his leather case. He stood, extended his hand, and Jacob accepted it warmly. "I wish both of you every happiness," Charles said sincerely before walking toward his waiting carriage. As the horses carried him down the long road toward town, Jacob remained standing on the porch until the carriage disappeared beyond the cottonwood trees. The valley became quiet once again, filled only with the rustling grass and distant songs of meadowlarks. Naya joined him without saying a word. Together they watched sunlight spread across the fields where young willow trees now swayed gently beside the creek. After a peaceful silence, Jacob finally turned toward her. "When you first arrived," he said softly, "I thought you were asking for work." Naya looked at him with warm, curious eyes. He smiled in a way she had never seen before, free from the loneliness that had once followed him. "Through every season. Now I understand," he continued. "You were giving this place something it had been missing for years." Naya lowered her eyes with quiet gratitude before slipping her hand gently into his. Neither of them needed another promise. The land, the home, and the peaceful valley stretching before them had already become the answer they had both been searching for, long before either one found the courage to speak it aloud. The weeks that followed settled over the Montana Valley with a quiet sense of purpose. Each sunrise seemed a little warmer than the last, and although winter still waited beyond the distant mountains, life on the ranch carried a new kind of confidence that had never existed before. Jacob no longer measured each day only by fences repaired or cattle counted. He found himself noticing smaller things that once escaped his attention completely. He noticed the way morning light rested upon the farmhouse porch after Naya swept it clean. He noticed birds returning to the young willow trees beside the creek where only bare banks had stood months earlier. He noticed that even silence had changed. It no longer felt empty. It felt peaceful. News of Jacob's decision quietly spread through the surrounding communities. Many people expected him to regret refusing such a generous offer. Yet as autumn slowly gave way to the first hints of winter, the opposite seemed to happen. Neighboring ranchers began visiting more often, sometimes bringing extra seed, sometimes asking advice about protecting streams or restoring worn pasture. They discovered that Jacob no longer answered every question himself. He often looked toward Naya before speaking, inviting her knowledge with complete respect. At first, a few visitors seemed surprised to receive guidance from an Apache woman, but surprise slowly gave way to appreciation as healthy fields and stronger harvests began appearing across the valley. One Saturday afternoon, the small church outside town organized a harvest gathering for every family living within riding distance. Jacob had attended those gatherings alone for years, usually arriving quietly and leaving before sunset. This time he rode beside Naya through golden grass glowing beneath the afternoon sun. Conversations paused briefly as they arrived, more from curiosity than hostility. Then old Samuel Brooks stepped forward carrying 2 warm mugs of cider. He handed one to Jacob and the other directly to Naya with an easy smile. "Good to see both of you," he said warmly. "The valley looks healthier this year." Others soon joined the conversation. Children chased one another between wagons filled with pumpkins and corn while older ranchers exchanged stories about weather, horses, and winter preparations. Naya spent much of the afternoon teaching several young girls how to weave simple baskets from willow branches gathered beside nearby streams. Laughter gradually replaced hesitation. By the time the evening meal was served beneath strings of lanterns hanging between cottonwood trees, very few people seemed to remember that she had once been considered a stranger. As the gathering came to an end, Jacob and Naya rode home beneath a sky crowded with brilliant stars. The crisp night air carried the comforting scent of wood smoke drifting from distant chimneys, and their horses walked quietly along the familiar trail leading back toward the ranch. Halfway home, Jacob gently slowed his horse beside the creek where the young willow trees swayed softly in the moonlight. He looked toward the farmhouse, glowing warmly in the distance before turning to Naya. "When you first arrived," he said quietly, "I thought this place belonged to my family because they built it." Naya listened without interrupting. Jacob smiled gently. "Now I understand that a home is not built only with lumber, stone, or land. It is built by the people who choose to care for it together." Naya looked toward the peaceful ranch where lantern light shone through every window, reflecting softly across the calm water beside the pasture. She reached into the pocket of her woven shawl and removed a small wooden carving shaped like a cottonwood leaf. She placed it carefully into Jacob's hand. "My grandfather carved this many years ago," she said. "He believed a home should always remember the tree that first gave it shade." Jacob closed his fingers around the smooth carving, feeling its warmth despite the cool night air. As they continued riding toward the welcoming lights of the farmhouse, he realized that the greatest change on the ranch had never been healthier fields, stronger fences, or fuller barns. The greatest change was that every road leading home no longer ended with one lonely rider. Many years passed across the Montana Valley as gently as the changing seasons, and no one could remember the exact day when people stopped calling it Jacob Carter's ranch and simply began calling it the welcoming ranch beyond the cottonwood trees. Time left its quiet marks everywhere. The young willow branches beside the creek grew into graceful trees whose roots held the banks firm through every spring rain. The weathered barn received new beams but kept its familiar shape. The old farmhouse still welcomed each sunrise with smoke rising from its stone chimney, yet laughter now echoed through rooms that had once known only silence. Jacob's dark hair slowly turned silver, and the lines upon his face deepened beneath years of honest work, but his smile became easier with every passing season. Beside him, Naya continued tending the gardens, teaching children how to understand the land instead of simply using it, and reminding every visitor that patience often accomplished what force never could. Ranchers from neighboring valleys came not only to trade cattle or borrow equipment, but to seek advice about streams, pasture, and growing families. Apache relatives visited freely, sharing meals beneath wide wooden porches with settlers whose grandparents might once have feared one another. No speeches ever announced those changes. They happened quietly, one shared supper, one repaired fence, and one trusted handshake at a time. One golden autumn afternoon, grandchildren raced across the pasture chasing butterflies while horses grazed peacefully beneath the shade of the tall cottonwood trees. Their joyful laughter drifted across the fields like birdsong carried by a gentle breeze. Inside the farmhouse, the small wooden carving shaped like a cottonwood leaf rested beside an old family photograph, while the woven shawl Naya had carried on the day she first arrived remained carefully folded over the back of the same rocking chair where she often watched sunsets beside Jacob. The years had transformed ordinary objects into treasured memories without either of them noticing when it happened. As evening settled over the valley, the youngest grandchild wandered onto the porch holding the little wooden carving in both hands. "Grandfather," the child asked softly, "why do you keep this leaf where everyone can see it?" Jacob accepted the carving gently, turning it between his weathered fingers while warm sunlight stretched across the fields that had shaped his entire life. He smiled toward Naya before answering, "Because a home should always remember the person who helped it grow." The child looked toward the willow trees lining the creek and then back at the farmhouse glowing warmly in the fading light. "Did grandmother build this ranch?" Jacob shook his head with quiet affection. "No," he replied. "The buildings were already here." He paused for a moment, listening to the wind moving through the cottonwood branches exactly as it had on the afternoon when Naya first stood waiting outside the gate. She built everything that could not be measured with lumber, nails, or land. Naya lowered her eyes with a gentle smile, while the children continued playing across the pasture, unaware that they were growing up inside the very answer two lonely lives had been searching for. The sun slowly disappeared behind the distant Montana mountains, covering the valley in soft shades of amber and gold. Lanterns glowed warmly through every farmhouse window as evening settled peacefully over the ranch. Jacob reached for Naya's hand, and together they watched another beautiful day come quietly to its end. Looking across the fields that no longer belonged only to one family, but had become a place of welcome for many, Jacob understood a simple truth that would remain long after both of them were gone. Land may be inherited, houses may be built, and seasons will always come and go, but a true home begins the moment one kind heart changes another forever.